Hello, and welcome to the Mill Valley Historical Society's First Wednesday Speaker Series, an event we host the first Wednesday of every month, usually at the Mill Valley Public Library, but for now, because of the pandemic, safely online. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm on the board of directors for the Mill Valley Historical Society, in charge of the First Wednesday Speaker Series and our very popular oral history program. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome authors and siblings, Margaret and David Talbot, to share about their recent collaboration, By the Light of Burning Dreams, the Triumphs and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution. It is an insightful look into the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s and the campaigns of activism that accompanied them. But before we begin, I want to say to all of you out there who are members of the Mill Valley Historical Society, thank you for your support. And to those of you who are not, you really ought to be. Membership to the Mill Valley Historical Society ensures that you will be alerted to future monthly speaker presentations, such as tonight's. You will also receive Chuck Oldenburg's charming Mill Valley history vignettes via email. And you will be updated on other historical events in our town and nearby. And the membership to the Mill Valley Historical Society is so affordable and just a click away on our Mill Valley Historical Society website. Also, I'd like to give special thanks to the Mill Valley Public Library for allowing the Historical Society to continue our speaker series in this safe and accessible format. Tonight's talk is in question and answer format, and it will last about an hour, maybe just a little longer with these two. And then we'll take some time for questions and comments from the audience. With us tonight is our much loved Mill Valley history librarian, Natalie Snoyman. She's responsible for making us look like we know what we're doing in this webinar format. Also, she'll be organizing questions and responding to comments as they come in so I can read them out loud to David and Margaret at the end of their talk. Natalie, as always, we thank you for your help. For those unfamiliar with Zoom meetings and webinars, here's a brief tutorial on how things work. For practical purposes, the audience must be muted for this webinar, but functional tools are located at the bottom of your screen to help us communicate with each other. If you can't see them now, just hover your cursor over the area and they should appear. Now, look for the chat icon. The chat tool allows you to post comments, say hello to friends, and we encourage you to add substantive information during tonight's event. Next, the Q&A option. The Q&A option is where you can post questions you may have about tonight's presentation or anything else related to the topic of conversation. And I'll address all those questions to David and Margaret after their presentation. But if you have comments or personal stories to share, the chat room is the best place for that. There are other Zoom options to explore on your own, but they are not pertinent to tonight's event, so we'll move along. This is David's second presentation with us. It was 5 years ago, almost to the day, he filled the Mill Valley Public Library to maximum capacity and beyond, actually, with his talk about his very popular book, Season of the Witch, Enchantment, Terror, and the Deliverance in the City of Love. Later, I interviewed him for our oral history program, and I urge you all to go to the oral history collection at the Mill Valley Public Library website and treat yourself to what is a very compelling hour-and-a-half long interview that might explain in part why all the Talbot children are so gifted. David Talbot is the New York Times best-selling author of Devil's Chessboard Brothers, The Hidden Story of the Kennedy Years, Season of the Witch, Enchantment, Terror, and Deliverance in the City of Love, which was a San Francisco bestseller for 4 years, and most recently, Between Heaven and Hell, a memoir about the stroke he had in 2017. He founded pioneering online magazine Salon, and he was senior editor of Mother Jones and a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. He has written for numerous publications, and he posts at thedavidtalbotshow.com. David lives with his family in San Francisco. Margaret Talbot has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2004 and was a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and an executive editor of The New Republic. Her writing has appeared in various outlets, including The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the New York Times Book Review. She is a recipient of the Whiteling Writers Award and the New American Foundation Fellowship, among many other honors, and is the author of The Entertainer, Movies, Magic, and My Father's 20th Century. Margaret lives in Washington, D.C. David and Margaret, welcome to the First Wednesday Speaker Series. And thanks. Hi. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, and congratulations on your book. I read it, and it was riveting. I augmented the reading with hours on YouTube, watching historical videos on several events that are described in the books and interviews with the counterculture activists involved. This book basically hijacked my life and made me intolerant of any interruptions or responsibilities that took me from it. That is how compelling it is. You write that the first American Revolution was fought to secure representation and freedom from an unwanted empire, but that revolution didn't win rights for everyone. Your book centers on another wave of activism that occurred much later in the 1960s and 70s on the heels of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. And I thought we might just give a brief description of each chapter, and Natalie's got some images to show. Here we go. Chapter 1 focuses on civil rights leader Martin Luther King and civil rights and anti-war activist Tom Hayden, both Tom's early years in Berkeley when he was part of the Red Family Collective, and then his transition to LA and his marriage to Jane Fonda, an activist, a strong one in her own right and a hero of mine, and then on to his political career. And the next chapter is about the Black Panther organization, which was centered in Oakland with leaders Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, but also the very powerful and influential women within the organization, such as Kathleen Cleaver, wife of Eldridge Cleaver. You go on to talk about the women's movement and Jane, a Chicago-based organization run by women, such as Heather Booth, who provided safe, albeit illegal, abortions to thousands of women. Also, you talk about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers Movement, incredible chapter there. And finally, let me get to the last one. You get into, I'm so sorry. I've got a little problem with this. Hang on a second.
Craig Rodwell and the
yes.
Stonewall Uprising.
Yes. That was a remarkable chapter. And hang on one second. I'm going to pull up. Here we go. Yes, it is really fantastic in that there are things that I had no idea about this chapter. For example, that the mob owned most of the gay bars in New York. So that was amazing. Also, you focus on the genesis of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Marlon Brando, and other celebrities who ventured away from the glamour and the glitch and into the trenches of resistance. And finally, you close with an incredibly powerful chapter on AIM, the American Indian movement, with leaders such as Dennis Banks and Russell Means and Madonna Thunderhawk and others, with special emphasis on their occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. That is a lot. So first of all, again, I want to say welcome. And I have my first question for you when you're ready.
We're ready.
We're ready. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. You both are prodigious writers. What prompted you to write this particular book? and why now?
Well, it was wonderful, first of all, working with my sister. We'd never worked together before the same way. And it was a great collaboration. It was, I think you used the word seamless, Deborah, at one point, and it was a seamless collaboration. What motivated me, and maybe was slightly different from Margaret, I'm 10 years older. I was a foot soldier in many of these movements, several of them, particularly the anti-war movement during the Vietnam years. And now we're handing off the baton, just like the Olympics, to a younger generation, to our kids who are in their 20s, and to a whole new generation of activists. We saw them on the streets, and it was very inspiring after the tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And to us, I think, to me in particular, it was a way to complete the circle, to hand down the lessons that we'd learned the hard way, frankly, about the revolutionary activism of the past when we were young ourselves, in our 20s and so on, teens. And we think it's very important for particularly the next generation of activists to learn these lessons about leadership, about organization, about inspiration, about longevity. How do you stay at this year after year when the country seems so, resistant to change and seems sometimes, frankly, be going backwards? So this book, in a way, I wanted to sit down with as many of people who are still living, the leaders of these movements, and those who weren't still living. We wanted to talk to others who work closely with them. Margaret and I are both journalists. We love talking to people, interviewing people, getting the story from the horse's mouth. And it was great to work with her and be able to touch this history in personal ways, and to be able to glean some lessons from these amazing narratives. Because as you say, it's really compelling stories. These stories are amazing, these men and women who stood their ground against incredible resistance, surveillance, harassment, jailing, beatings, assassination in some cases. And yet they moved history forward together with the movements they led. And so I think it's important, as I say, for the younger activists to learn from both their mistakes as well as their accomplishments.
Yeah, I would just add to that. David said that very well, as always, but I would just add that, yeah, as David said, he's 10 years older than I am. So, and I have 3 older siblings. We have a brother and a sister, all of whom were in various ways involved with the women's health movement in Santa Cruz, or SDS at Wesleyan, our other brother. And so I very much grew up, admiring, being inspired by my older siblings, but also feeling like I kind of missed out on I was born in 1961. I was a little too late to be part of the kind of really exciting surge of activism in the late 60s and 70s. But I very much feel that my life has been shaped by it, that I've been a beneficiary of it, particularly of the women's movement, and also of the gay rights movement. As a mom of a gay daughter, I think about that a lot. So I feel like David used the phrase closing a circle. I sort of felt like it gave me a chance to go back. I have memories of going up to visit David and Cindy, our sister, when they were student activists in Santa Cruz and lived in a feminist collective in an old Victorian house, and I would stay with them, and it was, fascinating and kind of magical to me. And there was a lot I needed to learn about it too, about that era that I'd lived through in a kind of funny, child observer kind of way. So yeah, it was wonderful to be able to work with David on it. And as he said, to actually talk to so many of the activists who we were able to talk to.
Yes, I do believe I interview people myself, and there is a sense of urgency in getting the personal stories from people that are aging.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I appreciate the work you did. Something I noticed and I really appreciated in your balanced portrayal of these activists is that there's no sugarcoating in this book. these are brilliant and complicated individuals, and you put a concerted effort into portraying them honestly. And you also included in this book the influence of women in what was admittedly chauvinistic organizations. Can you speak to the lens of which you view these people, and why you chose to be so frank about who they were?
Well, Margaret has some unique observations about this, and I'll let her speak about that. But for me, there was a certain amount of hero worship, frankly. When I was a young foot soldier in these movements, I would go listen to Bobby Seale, I would go listen to Tom Hayden speak, and to me, they were heroes, and flawed heroes, but heroes. Of course, when I became a journalist and read more about their activities and talked to people who'd worked closely with them, some of the rose-colored glasses that I'd viewed them when I was younger kind of fell away from my eyes. It was our intent as journalists at the ripe old age, and I'm going to be 70 this year. Margaret's 10 years younger. But at my age, I really did want to tell this history straight, with no kind of spin on it at all. And again, to me, it was lessons that I needed to learn, as well as a younger generation. So, and to me, just as a storyteller, because I think that's what Margaret and I essentially are. We're from a family of storytellers. Our dad was an old Irish actor. Margaret wrote a wonderful family memoir, The Entertainer, as you said about him. And we learned how to tell a story. And these are great stories. The Black Panthers, Tom Hayden, the American Indian movement. They're heroes, but flawed heroes. And frankly, their human imperfections make them more interesting, just from a story point of view. So we want to look at them, flaws and all. It's not hagiography by any means. It's, I think, the most honest portrayal of these people that I've come across. And Margaret and I read a lot of other material as we were putting together this book. It's both engaged with them, it's both supportive of them and of the goals they were trying to achieve against all odds, but we didn't flinch from telling their whole stories and the mistakes they made, the tragedies often in their lives. Certainly Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who descended into drug addiction and gangsterism. Tom Hayden, I knew Tom personally. I love Tom. I thought he was the most brilliant strategist to come out of the New Left. And Tom had his own problems, personal problems, which we talk about: drinking, excessive drinking, alcoholism. They were haunted people in some ways. And maybe, like Martin Luther King said, it took a crazy kind of courage to do what these people did, to stand up against the forces of the national security state, police agencies, the FBI, to go to prison, to have your life constantly being threatened, and the lives of your family. It does take a crazy kind of courage. And we ask a lot of these leaders. And just to close out, I feel in some ways this book is an argument for good leadership. And I know that's not particularly popular among young radicals today, among young activists. We're supposed to have a horizontal kind of structure of movement building. And leaders are often suspected. And of course, they have made mistakes, and they were eliminated sometimes violently. But my own feeling, and I think Margaret shares this, is that good leadership is a valuable, valuable asset. And we need to do a better job of protecting and supporting the good leaders.
And that's why we really did want to focus, not only for the storytelling, but we did want to focus on individuals at sort of turning points in their lives and in the lives of the movement, and brave decisions that they made. And, that's not to say, of course, we don't subscribe to some great man theory of history, and we very much, are aware of and honor all of the activists who went into these movements. But we do feel these leaders were very important galvanizing forces, and we wanted to focus on that. And just to go back to something you were asking, Deborah, about the importance of women in these movements, and the fact, I think one of the things that comes out of this book is the way in which movements come out of a sense of previous movements or previous ideals falling short. So, we say it's the Second American Revolution because so many of the activists in the 60s and 70s actually looked to the Constitution and the language of democracy and citizenship that started this country and said, yes, these are wonderful ideals, but they left so many people out. They left so many groups in American history out. And so we want to now extend those principles and extend those ideals. And actually, second wave feminism kind of started in that spirit too, because so many of the founders of second wave feminism were people who had been involved in the civil rights movement and in the student anti-war movement, who then looked around and said, we believe in all these ideals, but some of these ideals aren't being applied to us, this egalitarian spirit. We are the women in the movement and we're making the peanut butter sandwiches, and we're expected to be cool, chicks, and we're not being listened to. And, women who would get up to speak at some of the New Left conventions were, dragged from the stage or hooted off. And so that became then a galvanizing force to say, we share these ideals with you, our brothers in this movement, and yet they aren't being applied to us. So I think, the sense that a movement with high ideals is not living up to them is this engine of creation of the new movements, the next movements.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in your book, there's a few different quotes from male leaders who own, sometimes a little later than they might have, the significance of the women and how they were challenged and how they didn't necessarily like it at first, but they eventually came around. How impactful was the civil rights movement in the seeding of other movements? You just spoke of this now, but many of the people portrayed in your book had a common beginning. Can you speak to the influence of the civil rights movement in relation to subsequent movements, and how the training that the people received in the civil rights movement, where it's able to galvanize them to go on with some level of confidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was absolutely critical, because it was not only the first, for many people, this awakening to the legacy of American racism was so powerful and so galvanizing in terms of ideas, but then in terms of training and organizing, as you say, so many people who went on to become important in movements like the United Farm Workers or in women's liberation started off as volunteers or organizers in the civil rights movement, and of course who went on to Black Power movements as well. But people who some of the volunteers, white and Black, who worked in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, for example, in 1964, who had all of that training and organizing and also in defying the law in ways that could be productive and not merely self-destructive, and in very, very dangerous situations where they were being threatened by local law enforcement and often killed and harassed, and by the Klan. So that kind of training and just being brave, being bold, being willing to defy the law, all of those things were very, very influential. And just, yeah, as you say, such a seedbed of later movements.
I saw that, Deborah, when I was working on Season of the Witch. I interviewed Terry Hallinan, who's no longer with us, sadly, but was, of course, became district attorney, had grown up in a very radical family in Marin County. And Terry went south during Freedom Summer and came back and lived in the Upper Haight. And a lot of the political resistance against the freeway that was going to tear apart the Haight. That was
7 freeways that were going to, yeah.
And at SF State, San Francisco State, that became a kind of center of radical activism during the 60s. A lot of that, again, like Margaret was saying, was born in the cradle of the South. And Terry Hallinan and others went south and were trained to be fighters, basically, and came back from those experiences bloodied, but very experienced and tough.
When you're reading about these people in your book, and we're all sort of in the same realm of the age, and I'm thinking of them as adults, but you're reminded when reading the book how very, very young people were. that these activists, how very young, early 20s, late teens, into the older ones were in their late 20s. It's remarkable. And there was a kind of community going on of resistance. In your book, you describe the cross-pollination between movements, the ways in which the various groups both educate and support each other. For example, you talk about when Martin Luther King invited Black Panther Bobby Seale to come speak at one of his events. And can you talk about both that and also how this kind of collaboration was viewed by our federal government?
Well, that was another important theme that Margaret and I wanted to stress in this book, that these movements, these leaders were not working in isolation from one another. There was a lot of collaboration, a lot of fraternity and between these different groups and leaders. And it was done in a very conscious way. I was actually shocked when Bobby Seale, during my interview with him, one of my interviews, told me about Martin Luther King, that he reached out to him as he was planning his Poor People's March on Washington in 1968. He reached out to Bobby and the Black Panthers through Ralph Abernathy, of course, was his right-hand man. And what Martin was attempting to do was very radical in Washington. It was not simply to march on Washington, it was to occupy the nation's capital with a broad spectrum of activists and radicals, Black Panthers, United Farm Workers, Native American militants, and so on. He was trying to build a rainbow coalition of people who were going to demand an end to the war in Vietnam and for the sources to be diverted instead to domestic spending, urgent domestic needs. So this was quite a radical thing. And some people, including those I interviewed, said this was the final straw for the government. This is why Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was becoming increasingly radical as he went on in the 60s. The final sermon, as we point out in the introduction, that he was going to deliver at his church in Atlanta before he was killed in Memphis, was titled "Why America May Go to Hell." He thought America was on a terrible path towards spiritual and political, malaise. And he was trying to awaken the country with a cross-cultural movement. And he was a socialist, I think, clearly at the end. He was trying to lead a poor people's army against the elites in this country. And so he's not the sort of Santa Claus cuddly figure that we've been, told and educated, but miseducated. He was a revolutionary figure, Martin Luther King. And that was, I think, the great hope of the 60s, was that we could all come together like John Lennon sang, and force this country to really live up to its founding ideals, as Margaret was saying. And unfortunately, a lot of that dream was killed by bullets. Martin Luther King killed, Robert Kennedy killed the same year, just weeks later, John Kennedy earlier, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader, who we know the story about now because of the movie Judas and the Black Messiah. A lot of the national policy, I think, was carried out, national security policy, at the end of the barrel of a gun, frankly. That saying,
I call this question fear and paranoia, but it's not paranoia if they're really following you. And when you read about the J. Edgar Hoover's infiltration, basically the lengths he went to in his extensive surveillance and the plants and agents provocateurs that he infiltrated within various organizations and his concerted efforts to damage and destabilize their function. That guy was really on a mission. And it was a mercenary mission. Can you speak to the level of kickback that our government, these activists are young and they are scared. There is fear permeates this book. People talk about living with fear, and they knew it was real.
Well, I think in particular say that the chapter about John Lennon and Yoko Ono, what they were trying to do, he was not just some cuddly ex-Beatle who was dabbling in politics. We talk about his year of living dangerously with Yoko, his wife, and political partner in Greenwich Village. And he was associating with Black Panthers, with New Left leaders. And he wanted nothing less than to topple the presidency of Richard Nixon and to end the war in Vietnam. That was his stated mission. And he performed at benefit concerts. He spoke on television. He had access to the media that very few people have because he was an ex-Beatle. And he had enormous global stature. Very few musicians still to this day have the kind of reach that John Lennon did. He became increasingly radical in the last 2 years of his life, beginning really in the late 60s. And, you know, he was under strong harassment, strong kind of pressure from the federal government throughout his time in the US, including J. Edgar Hoover until he died, Attorney General John Mitchell under Nixon, the immigration officials. They targeted John Lennon. They wanted to deport him. They wanted to set him up on drug arrests. John Wiener, who's a friend of ours, the historian, wrote a wonderful book based on the Freedom of Information files that he got finally out of the federal government about John Lennon. And it's hair-raising to realize how much effort was aimed at, as they called it, I think, delegitimizing him and neutralizing him. That's the term they used. They wanted to neutralize John Lennon. And finally, he was neutralized in a very final way by being killed.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Please, you go.
I was just going to add something about that, which is that, you know, a lot of the reason that we know about, for example, what was called the COINTELPRO program, the FBI's, you know, extensive surveillance of all of these organizations, and of course, starting with Martin Luther King, is that there was a burglary that Quaker and anti-war activists in Pennsylvania in 1971 committed against a FBI office in Pennsylvania. And I think they did it, was it the night of the Super Bowl? Do you remember, David? They did it when they thought there would be distraction, because I think it was the Super Bowl, but it was I'm not good on major sporting events, but I think it was a major sporting event. Anyway, they were activists. We don't happen to talk about them in this book, but it's an amazing story. And actually a former Washington Post journalist named Betty Metzger wrote a great book called The Burglary about that incident a couple of years ago. But anyway, that was, you know, because of activists who did something, you know, pretty daring by breaking into this FBI office and stealing these files, that we know how, in part anyway, how extensive that surveillance was of the civil rights movement, Black activists on college campuses, et cetera, and even the women's movement.
And infiltration to police agents, informers who were placed within these movements. You know, Dennis Banks, who was co-founder of the American Indian Movement, his ex-wife and his bodyguard, who was with him virtually 24 hours a day, turned out to be police agents later. So there were literally thousands of police agents injected into these various organizations and movements throughout the country, and often with violent results. There was a shootout. They loved the old tactics of divide and conquer. There was a violent shootout on the UCLA campus in the 1960s between the Black Panthers and a rival organization, a Black organization called US. 2 Black Panther leaders were killed during that shootout. And that was instigated by the FBI. The murder of Martin Luther King was instigated by the FBI. So often these tactics were quite violent and were aimed at eliminating these leaders.
Yes. Yes. Has anybody ever calculated how much gazillions of dollars was spent in the infiltration campaigns? And
I haven't seen those figures, but it's quite a bit of money.
Yes. I remember telling you before, when we were talking the other day, that I used to stay at Bill Walton's family house, the basketball player in San Diego, when I was going to school there. And Bill was affiliated very distantly from the Symbionese Liberation Army. And I was followed all over Kansas. FBI agents were following me to my apartment and to my classes. I was nobody. And I wondered how much money is being spent. Had to have been gobs. This next question has to do with courage and chutzpah. And you talked about leadership before. But I'd like to go back to that, the power of leadership and the kinds of lessons we can extrapolate from your examination of what leadership means in your book. I know that you have strong feelings about leadership.
Yeah, David, why don't you start with that, and I'll add a thought.
I was going to say, Margaret, why didn't you talk about Heather Booth?
Oh, okay, sure.
Model.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think, as David said, there are many characters whose flaws, we explore. Heather, I would say, is not heavy on flaws, but she's a pretty admirable character all the way around. But she is somebody who started off in the as a volunteer in the civil rights movement. She grew up a doctor's daughter in Long Island and went to the University of Chicago, and then became very active as a student, as an undergraduate in the civil rights movement, and went down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer in 1964 and met Fannie Lou Hamer and other kind of legends of the civil rights movement, and really put her life on the line, as all of the volunteers there did. Just last week, I guess it was, the remarkable Bob Moses, who was the organizer who really put together this movement to the South in the Freedom Summer, just died, and he was a very soft-spoken, lovely man by all accounts, and was willing to ask people to put their life on the line because he was doing the same. He was Black, so obviously he was at greater risk. But and the idea of these white students going down was that they would turn the attention of the country to the plight of disenfranchised African Americans in Mississippi, and that they would provide some kind of physical protection just by being there. Although they were obviously were operating at great risk themselves. Anyway, she was active in that movement, and then she just became one of these people who was active across many movements, still is, but we focus on her role in founding the organization called Jane, which was an underground abortion service in Chicago in the late 60s and early 70s, prior to the legalization of abortion in 1973 by Roe v. Wade. And as I think you mentioned in the introduction, Deborah, that organization provided thousands of abortions to women who needed them safely and illegally, and with a lot of feminist consciousness. And she founded this movement founded this group as an undergrad when she got a call from a friend in her dorm at the University of Chicago saying, "My sister, desperately needs an abortion. Do you have any idea where she would get one?" Heather actually didn't have any idea, but she had all these contacts in the civil rights movement. And when she thought about doing something bold or brave or illegal, but according to her principles, she thought of going to the civil rights movement, and she did. And there was a doctor actually who was a Black obstetrician from the South who had been involved in the civil rights movement, who was being pursued by the Klan and had gone to Chicago. And he actually provided the first abortions, and then eventually the women trained themselves to provide them in this spirit of kind of extreme do-it-yourselfism that they were showed a lot of chutzpah in doing.
And they did more than just provide abortions, because there was a lot of fear around abortions, of course, back then, these backroom abortions. These women provided comfort. They provided education. They provided options.
They did. They talked to women about birth control. They talked to them about how they could, reimagine their lives and their futures. They talked to them about feminism and how they could pursue more satisfying relationships in all senses of the word with the men in their lives. So they were providing this alternative. They were building this alternative institution, providing this service, but also building a feminist movement around it.
Another great discussion of leadership, I thought, was in a chapter you wrote about the gay movement. And I was thinking while reading this chapter, Margaret, I was thinking about when I was studying earth sciences and I learned about elastic rebound theory. I'm thinking about what makes a leader, actually. And elastic rebound theory essentially describes that how forces build up to create a moment magnitude. And when the strength, and they say in elastic rebound, when the strength of the strain exceeds the strength of the rock, you will have a seismic event. And I think it's a good metaphor for what perpetuated the Stonewall riots in New York City, which led directly to the first gay pride marches in 1973. And while thinking about that, I thought about pride, the word itself, which is powerful and galvanizing for many of these groups. And I looked up the definition, which I wanted to read out loud. The feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own achievements and the achievements of those with whom one is closely associated, or from qualities or positions that are widely admired. The consciousness of one's own dignity. And pride means having a feeling of good and worthy. In a sense, it means having a feeling of self-respect. And when you read about how gays were treated in New York City at that time, how degrading, how I would like you to talk about that stage, the pressures that preceded that moment magnitude when something just snapped that night. And from that came such leadership and unity.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I wish I'd had that metaphor when I was writing. I knew I should have studied geology or physics, but unfortunately, I never did. But no, that's a great metaphor. And yes, that sense of the pressures building up to something seismic. Yeah. So I mean, this is if you kind of go back to the '60s in New York. There's obviously, as in every big city, and maybe even more in New York, a big gay population, and there's really the limitations on where they can go are extreme, or where they can go and socialize and be together and meet people and find sexual partners. So there's cruising that takes place on beaches and in certain parks, but that people are constantly being arrested by the cops for that. So that's highly risky, because you're not only risking arrest, but also, public shaming, losing your job, being estranged, or abandoned by your family, all kinds of repercussions. And then there are these bars like the Stonewall that you can go to, where, they water down the drinks, and they're kind of crummy places in some ways, and they're mostly owned by the mafia, actually. And there's a whole system of paying off the cops that the mafia engages in to keep the bars open, because actually there are laws that prohibit things like people of the same sex dancing together, or serving. Actually, for a while, you could not serve alcohol to someone you knew to be gay. These are strictures that are kind of unimaginable to live under, but in many ways. But people did, and they made their way, and they. But periodically there would be these police raids when the police weren't paid off, or something fell through, or when it was just this kind of kabuki performance they would go through. They would break things up, they would drag people in to be arrested, and then they would reopen the next day. So that would happen a lot. And it happened, in other bars and other clubs in other cities that gay people frequented. And there were other occasions in San Francisco, at the Compton's cafeteria in LA, at a place called the Black Cat, where patrons did rise up. And even though they were afraid of being publicly shamed and afraid of the repercussions of being arrested, they did fight back. But what was really important about the Stonewall, I think, and we say in the book, it's always hard to know what exactly, kind of to your metaphor, what the elements in the pressure cooker are. But you can look, because there are this had happened a million times before, these raids on the bars. And sometimes people rose up and sometimes they didn't. But, I think partly people rose up because they were feeling the energy of all the other movements. This was in the Village, and, in New York, that was a real site of various political uprisings and demonstrations too. So people felt that. It was a very hot night. It was a full moon, and also a lot of the transgender kids and sort of drag queens who frequented the area, not so much the bar, but the area outside, were very defiant and just decided to do Rockette-style kicks down the street and lead the cops on a merry chase, sort of Keystone Cop style, because they knew all the labyrinthine little alleys and streets down in the Village better than the cops did. And they were literally doing, high kicks. And that gave people a jolt of energy and defiance, and that was crucial. But the other thing that was crucial, and the person we focus on in the chapter, is a guy named Craig Rodwell, who opened the first gay bookstore in the world, and it was in the Village. And there he is, and he decided that this moment shouldn't just pass, that we shouldn't just, that there was something extraordinary about the fact that all these kind of marginalized and, somewhat despised people and had kind of risen up like this. And so he decided to organize, with the help of other activists, but he was really a key figure in it, the first Pride March, which was a year after Stonewall. So it was in June of 1970, and it was to commemorate the Stonewall uprising. And he had no idea how many people were going to turn out. He had no idea whether it would be broken up by the cops, whether they would get permission to march. But it turned into this amazing celebration, quite large, much larger than he expected. And as you said, pride was the key element, that we're owning our own dignity and our own joy, and we're out here in the street together. And that was really the kickoff of the modern gay rights movement, as we know.
I have to read a couple of the signs that were carried, because they're so funny. Here's one during the parade. Do you think homosexuals are revolting? You bet your sweet ass we are. And
yeah, I love that spirit.
And are we a load of screaming queens? Yes. Yeah, that's a fabulous. Craig is a very compelling leader. He is indomitable in his spirit, and yet later in life, as in many of these leaders, they seem to culminate in a moment of magic. And then how things go later or even before. And again, as to you wanting to give an unvarnished description of these people, I think it's really very, actually, it is galvanizing in that such people that have the same problems as anyone else. These leaders weren't special. They were just like us, compelled to react to something that was unjust. It makes it more attainable, the idea of getting involved in leadership. And that's one of the reasons why I like how you're so honest. When we're talking about pride and self-respect, we can't not talk about the Black Panthers. And David, you have a wonderful chapter on that. You wrote that chapter, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I was looking at the Black Panthers 10-point program, which you probably got memorized, and was juxtaposing it to today. And I'd like to get to that. But first, just informing people about the Black Panther, because I remember the Black Panther, growing up, and there was a fearsome vibe about it. And in studying and understanding why this was so in your book, it helps take the fear factor out when you're looking at how powerful these people were. I thought maybe you might be able to just give us a little bit of information, like the origin of the name Black Panther. Where did that come from?
Well, that came from a logo in Alabama, actually. People, again, the connection with the civil rights movement in the South, resisting white supremacy in that county, Lowndes County, Alabama. And Huey Newton happened to read about this and the fact that they used the Black Panther in Alabama as a symbol of resistance. They said the panther never attacks just for the sake of attacking, but if you corner the panther and give it no options, it will violently attack you. And so it was a self-defense. That was the key to the Black Panther Party. That was in their very name. It was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And so it was very important to Huey Newton and even more to Bobby Seale, who I think was kind of the grown-up leader who founded the party. He was older than Huey. He was less hot-headed. He was more strategic in his thinking. It was very important for him in the use of arms to stress how they were for self-defense only. And Bobby, he acted out the whole scene for me when the Black Panthers, Huey, Bobby, and several others went down to West Oakland to the street where it was the night scene in West Oakland, where, you know, African-American people would get dressed up, go to nightclubs, go to nice restaurants, have a good time. And the white cops, who were notoriously racist in Oakland, would go down routinely and harass people, arrest people, throw them up against the wall, you know, steal money from them. And it was like open season on Black victims. And so the Panthers decided this was going to stop. This was their community. Huey Newton was in law school at the time. They read very carefully the statutes on the books in California. They understood that they could observe police and hold guns, weapons, if they stood a certain distance away. I think it was 10 to 12 feet. And of course, they did this one night in Oakland. They surrounded a cop who was harassing an African-American citizen. They decided only Huey Newton should talk. Only one person should talk to keep their communication with the police officer very simple and very direct. And Huey Newton just said, we have the right by law to stand here with guns and observe you. And the cop, of course, got so incensed and freaked out, he finally drove away. And they knew this was going to use the term Margaret's been using a lot, galvanizing moment. And it was on the streets of Oakland. All these Black men and women gathered around observing this, couldn't believe the courage of these guys. And the fact that they were so disciplined, because Bobby Seale had been in the military. He was in the Air Force, and he knew how to conduct something in a very disciplined fashion. And, even the way they dressed, the uniform, the black beret, they said came from watching old movies of the French underground during World War II. The blue shirts, the black slacks. He'd seen Huey Newton on campus at Merritt College in Oakland wearing that one day and thought that was really cool looking. Then he added the black leather jacket and so on. So even the way they dressed was in a very disciplined way, a very cool looking way, very stylistic, and was meant to grab people's attention. And of course it did. And Bobby Seale said, ladies and gentlemen, after the cop drove away, I'm Bobby Seale. I'm the chairman of the Black Panther Party. This is my friend Huey Newton. He's Minister of Defense. We're having our first meeting at such and such a place, the headquarters of the Black Panther Party, tomorrow, and you can come learn more about us. And some people, of course, did. And it was those kind of actions that really captured the community's attention and the media's attention. And when they marched on the Capitol in Sacramento with guns, that, of course, was another moment, turning point in their lives. The problem, though, is, of course, when you use guns for a dramatic effect like that, you're putting yourself at risk. And the guns become part of the action and part of the politics in a way that you can't really predict. And Huey Newton embraced, I think, guns to the detriment of the rest of the Panther programs. They did some wonderful programs in the community, free breakfast for kids who were hungry, health clinics. They were providing services, essential services that no one else was doing at the time. And the Black Panther Party was getting people's allegiance by delivering these services too. And ultimately, it was Bobby Seale's intention to go into electoral politics and build a political machine in Oakland. He was gifted. He was a former stand-up comedian, a former jazz musician. He knew how to work a stage. He was a great campaigner. He ran in the campaign in 1973 for mayor of Oakland. He got a lot of votes. He lost against a white Republican, but he could have gone on, I think, to build a very successful political machine in Oakland and maybe other cities as well. But Huey Newton by then was in a downward spiral, using drugs. The Huey Newton who went into prison was not the same Huey Newton who came out of prison. I think, those who knew him, like Peter Coyote, who I know is a friend of yours, it's told me that he was quite different. He was more volatile, he was more temperamental, he was more violent. And I think that being put in isolation the way he was for months really did a number on his head, and solitary and so on. And, there's drug experimentation being conducted on prisoners at Vacaville, where Huey was held for a number of months. So God knows what was done to him in prison, but he came out and he was still a very charismatic figure, still commanded the loyalty of many people in the party, but he soon began to rely too much on cocaine, on cognac, and then he descended further into, I think, criminality and gangsterism. And by the end of his life, of course, he's killed by a rival drug dealer, a young drug dealer on the streets of West Oakland, not far from where he confronted police in a more, I think, disciplined and heroic way. So, sad story with Huey. Bobby continued to go on after the Panthers dissolved. He led, I think, a very dignified and very respectable life as an educator and a political activist. Bobby's still alive. I was chilled and inspired and thrilled when he got up at age 80, whatever he was 3 years ago when I interviewed him for the book, and acted out this scene in West Oakland where they confront the policeman for the first time with guns. That's the crazy courage the Black Panthers had. I still think it was the right thing to do. And if Huey Newton had been a different person, they would have been able to pivot. And frankly, the FBI, if they hadn't devoted so many resources to crushing the Panthers, infiltrating the Panthers, driving them crazy, literally, putting them in jail, I think that the Panthers would have gone on to have a much longer impact on political life in America than they did.
Huey Newton was a young man, very young, when he first started the Panthers. As you said, that Bobby Seale was a little older, and then in comes Eldridge Cleaver, who's experiencing himself and his wife. I'm looking at the 10 points program platform here, and thinking about the BLM movement. Apart from a few of them, it's the same requests.
The same demand.
We want freedom. We want the power to determine our destiny of our Black and oppressed communities. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the capitalist of our Black and oppressed communities. We want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings. They want to not be attacked. We want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of Black people, other people of color, all oppressed people inside the United States. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want an education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society.
Reparations for slavery. These are all demands that still could be issued today and be just as relevant today. And that's a sobering fact. 50 years ago, the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton wrote that document 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. And, it's just as relevant today, sadly, as it was back then.
We'll be talking about the continuation of something in a little bit. But you speak of the heavy price of resistance, how some people suffer the ultimate sacrifice and have to give their lives for their cause. And can you talk about the level of commitment, both of you, that so many of the people that are featured in your book give to their causes? I mean, this had to affect their lives. Did they have any other life besides their actions? I mean, these are all encompassing times.
Yeah, and I mean, there are people in our book like Dolores Huerta, who was a mother, who,
Mother of
uh,
12, I think.
yeah, many times
Many, many
over.
children.
Yeah, and probably some people here have seen the documentary that came out about her a few years ago, and I think, although I think she has good relationships with her children, as far as I know, they speak honestly about the price that they felt they paid, of not really having having a mother who was devoted primarily to the movement, yeah, I mean, of course there are the people who were jailed, harassed, or killed, but for other people, there were divisions in the movement where people lost friends, they lost, I mean, David's chapter on Tom Hayden talks about his sort of exile from the community he was part of for political reasons. There was a lot of that kind of thing, unfortunately. And so those are all painful passages. One thing I was struck by, is that there are, even though our book focuses on leaders, most of whom stayed involved in the movements and as long as they could, there were people who were just significant players for a moment, and those people also were important. I mean, some of the women who were involved with Jane, for example, went on to do other things, to work in the medical field, or in government, all kinds of things. But they did that one really daring thing, and it gave a lot of meaning to their life because they stepped out of line that one time. So I think that's maybe worth remembering too, that it's great to be a lifelong activist if you have the guts and stamina and spirit for it, and if you aren't worn down by it. But also it's good to step up, anytime in your life and be part of something bigger than yourself. And these movements all depended on people like that as well.
I was impressed by what Troy Garrity, who delivered a very beautiful speech on behalf of his father. He ended up using the name, I believe, of Tom Hayden's, mother, his mother's side, Garrity, because he don't be associated with either his mother, Jane Fonda, or Tom Hayden, not because he didn't love them, but for his acting career. And he's gone on to have, I think, a pretty successful acting career, Troy Garrity. But he talked about how their home on Wadsworth Avenue. And I remember it. I was at that home. I lived in Venice. They lived in Ocean Park, which is between Venice and Santa Monica. And it was a very porous household, a very ramshackle house Tom and Jane lived in. She, of course, was used to living in movie star kind of mansions. And she came down in life and was living in this very funky kind of bungalow that Tom had bought, the first house he ever bought. And it was not really much to look at. It was a very simple beach bungalow down near the ocean. And Troy talked about a homeless guy who lived on the street, and they allowed to move into their basement. And one day, little Troy came home from school, and the homeless guy was dressed in either Tom or Jane's clothes. I forget who. But, that was the kind of place it was. Our brother, who was an anti-war activist, Steve Talbot, worked with Tom at one point. This is the early 70s. And they were at a meeting. It was 4th of July. Tom, as usual, was still working. And a group of people at the Wadsworth house in Santa Monica. And Tom got a phone call. He froze and said, he hung up right away. He said, all right, hit the ground right away and turn off the lights, because someone had just called in a death threat. So I'm going to shoot up the house. That was the kind of thing that Tom and Jane had to put up with a lot. Jane talked very eloquently and very movingly about the disgusting letters that she would routinely get, an avalanche of mail from men wanting to torture her and kill her and rape her and murder her. That's the kind of pressure she had to put up with day in and day out. Fred Brampton, who was a dear friend of mine before he died, worked very closely with Tom and Jane. In fact, the first time I went to their Wadsworth house, Fred was sleeping on the floor in the sunroom in front. They had people crashing there all the time from the anti-war movement. Fred had been a very important activist in Southeast Asia during the war. And, Fred came back and he said that among many, he always had respected Tom Hayden because of his, reputation as a great anti-war leader. But he really came to respect Jane in some ways even more because of the enormous pressure she was under constantly. People hated her on the Republican right because she was a woman and a movie star and had given up her privilege, her beauty, her career for the movement. And there's something about that movement, and I remember this myself because I was part of it, that was religious. You belonged to it, you felt it changed your life, it sustained you. You knew people, your next door neighbors or others who were in the movement too. You had music that was born in the movement. John Lennon wrote songs, that were supposed to be political. Lesser musicians like Hallinan, who was friends with Tom and Jane. So you built a whole culture around your value system: music, theater, film, and that's what Tom and Jane, I think, were trying to do, something bigger than themselves. And at their best, that's what they accomplished.
You make a very good point here. It goes right to my next question, because when we talk about a culture of resistance, and you think back to the 60s and 70s, there's signage, there's art, there's poetry in the fields, there's theater, the plays, Hair, Jesus Christ Superstar, and music, so much music. A lot of the music from the late 60s and 70s had an infused sense of purpose, of social respect, social giving. And I remember one of the musicians I interviewed said that their band tried to use their music to create a creative anarchy. It was all very deliberate, and I don't really sense that so much these days.
Not enough.
Can we talk about how it is we can nurture a culture of resistance? How we can use the arts and all the other things we have at hand to help support necessary changes in our culture, and to continue the fight for the ones that have already been started.
Well, Margaret can answer this as well, but politics will break your heart. I'm 70 years old. I've had my heart broken by one candidate after the next. Those I get elected, those I can't get elected. We've all had this experience over time, and not just electoral politics, but trying to end wars. They keep grinding on and on. So politics, the Irish in me knows, will always break your heart. And you need something else to sustain yourself over time. And that's what you were talking about, Deborah. You need the music, the poetry, the theater. I think every chapter, there was some kind of cultural aspect to it that kept those leaders and those movements going. The farm workers had El Teatro Campesino, Luis Valdez, who was, I think, one of the great heroes of the farm workers movement in those days, a young playwright and theater director. And he created this thing that, they performed a guerrilla theater on the flatbed trucks in the fields, at college campuses. They took their message out to the world. And I saw them. I remember in Santa Cruz when I was a student there at UC Santa Cruz in the early 70s. And so it wasn't just the political message. It was that the values that and the world that we believed in, the new world that we all believed in, was conveyed through music and through theater and poetry and through culture as well. And I think if we hadn't had that, our wounds would have been more open, and we would have burned out sooner. I think you need a culture of resistance along with a political resistance.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I was really struck by, the feminist movement created so many of its own institutions, alternative health clinics, some of which are still in existence. But also like the Chicago Women's Liberation Union was this really vibrant organization that Jane, the abortion underground, became a part of, that had, a rock and roll band and a graphics collective and, a newsletter and a sports league and a this and a that. And, they were they were modeled a little bit on some things you see in socialist countries. They were modeled a little bit on some things you saw in Vietnam at that time, because some people had traveled there, some of the people who became organizers of the Women's Liberation Union. But I think, there's a lot of obviously wonderful music and culture coming out now, but there's a little less sense maybe of it being a counterculture and a little bit more sense of we're all sort of part of one big popular culture, or one big popular culture with its own, a kind of fragmented subcultures. But there's not so much of a sense of we're building a kind of non-sellout counterculture. That's not so much in vogue right now, I don't think, and that's maybe a little bit of a loss. So that consciousness that you are kind of outside of the mainstream, making your own music and other forms of culture. So and that they are kind of consciously resistant. I mean, I punk music had that, and that was sort of a little bit more, well, we overlapped in that era, David, but so it's not like there haven't been and a lot of early rap and other rap, but I feel like there's a bit of a sense of it all being swallowed up by sort of pop culture overall.
Modern media. If there was a chapter that seemed to really jump out with a sense of spiritualism and moral purpose, it's the final chapter. I can't say that more than others, but I have to say the chapter on the occupation of Wounded Knee, considering what happened there in 1890, and the collective spirit of that group is a very, very powerful chapter. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about AIM and the significance of what happened.
Well, thank you for calling that chapter out. I think it was very moving for me to research and write. And even the opening sentence of that chapter, I think, really says it all. The living could hear the dead at Wounded Knee in 1973.
I mean, literally. Even the agents could hear the dead.
Right. Even the federal agents thought they saw a ghost at night, ghost warriors. Of course, in 1890, over 300 Lakota men, women, and children were massacred by the regiment that was formerly under the command of George Armstrong Custer, and did it with such violence and mayhem that they even shot some of their own men. They were then thrown in a gully and buried in a mass grave, these Indian men, women, children. And so when AIM and the people of that reservation, Pine Ridge in South Dakota, decided to reoccupy or occupy that site, it was a sacred site. And they knew the symbolic power of what they were doing in 1973. And they were there to protest this corrupt government that was, run by a half-Indian, Dick Wilson, who had a private militia that he proudly called goons, and then went around shooting up the houses and beating up rivals. He'd won in a corrupt way the presidency of the reservation. And of course, they were also protesting decades and decades of federal treachery, one broken treaty after the next. And so the Indians finally said enough. We're going to take our stand here at Wounded Knee. And for over 3 months, they withstood an amazing amount of violence. 500,000 rounds of ammunition fired into that camp of men, women, and children by federal marshals, FBI, and the vigilantes under the command of the Pine Ridge chairman. And it's amazing, only 2 Indians were killed as a result of this violence. Finally, and this is what the chapter ends with, on the final night of the siege, when they finally had an understanding with the federal government, they knew that Dennis Banks, their charismatic leader, would probably be arrested and killed. That's what they feared. Just like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had been done 100 years before. And Dennis is with the headband here. Russell Means, of course, was the other great charismatic leader of AIM. So he had to be smuggled out that night. And Lenny Foster, a young Navajo, athletic guy, once on the farm team for the LA Dodgers, the former baseball player, agreed to lead the small group of men who smuggled Dennis Banks out that night through heavily fortified lines. It was like Vietnam. They had armored personnel carriers, they had infrared technology, they had flares, they had guard dogs, they had assault weapons. And so the fact that he was able to get out that night safely because of Lenny Foster's heroism, and I interviewed Lenny, who lives down on the Navajo Res in Arizona, is a miracle. And they saw it as a miracle. They saw it in spiritual terms. They went to the Sweat Lodge before they underwent their journey, their mission that night. They saw it as they would have protection, spiritual protection. They thought an owl at one point was guiding them to safety. They came near to disaster, as I write about in the book, but it's an amazing kind of event. And Dennis Banks went on to fight after that. He lived to fight another day, which is kind of the Indian motto in this country. And I interviewed Dennis at age 80 in 2017, shortly before he died after undergoing open heart surgery. And Dennis was a quiet, but still very charismatic man who told me his side of the story. And he went on to have a full life of being an activist, a very heroic life. And he died at age 80. So God bless him. And God bless Lenny Foster and his incredible courage, too, for leading Dennis Banks out that night.
Yes, it is an amazing story. I remember living to fight another day. I remember when my friend, land preservationist and environmentalist, Marty Griffin, once said to me, when you save land, you have to keep on saving it. In other words, it never stops. And in your book, Madonna Thunderhawk, one of the very interesting and powerful women leaders in the AIM movement, and I have to mention that in that chapter, the men say in the interviews that it was the women that kept them strong. And at one point, when things were getting really gritty, the women said to the men, you can go if you want, but we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Very strong women.
And Dennis said the women shamed him and shamed Russell Means into taking a more militant stand. It was the women who drove that action in many ways.
So she summarizes her effort of activism in this way, and I'm going to quote her from your book. It is a continuous struggle, the war that will never be won. As long as we have a land base in this country, we will be constantly in battle. We're not going anywhere. It's our home. We've been at this a long time, long before our lifetime. So it's all about fighting and gaining some ground here and there, you know. Someday I'll be gone and we're only responsible for our lifespan, what we do while we're here. We did the hard work, stood our ground like our ancestors, and now it's your turn, your time, our children and grandchildren. We had our time. We did the best we could. They can read about me in your book, and then they'll go, here's what she did. Now, what should we do?
I got chills just hearing that again. And I remember Madonna saying that to me, and it was a chilling and inspiring statement that she made.
Yes. So many people these days are overwhelmed by how much needs fixing and how much can one tiny person do in a difference, how much of a difference can they make in this great big chaotic world. But I believe your book acts as a kind of playbook for future, just as you said in the opening of our discussion, for future activism. And I really appreciate, for those reasons and for the personal stories, and as an oral historian, I believe in the power of story, how significant this collaboration is. We want to also give credit to Margaret's husband, who contributed the chapter on Cesar Chavez. Yes.
Yes. Arthur
And
Allen.
it's getting on time to close, but I have one last question for you both. Is there anything we haven't talked about tonight that we should include in this discussion?
I think it's been a great discussion, and I think you've asked some really wonderful questions. Yeah, I would just say that we really do hope the book will be inspiring to contemporary movements, because there is so much to work on. We do feel that this book shows the power of people going out in the streets, putting their bodies on the line, building coalitions across movements, recognizing and trying to protect leaders, and being willing to work both inside and outside the system, which almost everyone we write about did in one degree or another, and showed flexibility in that way. Willingness to run for public office in some cases, and also to commit acts of civil disobedience and work to create alternative institutions. So I hope all those strategies are part of the arsenal of future movements. David, do you want to add anything?
Well put, Margaret. I would just add that I think what we're up against today is what we were up against, decades ago. It's still the forces of greed and death versus the forces of life and solidarity, human solidarity. And there's nothing different from what we were fighting 50 years ago than what we're fighting today. If anything, it's gotten just even more, I think, terrifying and existential, but the threat to human life on this planet because of climate change. We know who is profiting from that. We know who's profiting from greed and death, and we can't allow this to happen. We have to come together again. There has to be another American Revolution. And I think like Margaret said, the heroes of the last revolution point the way to the future.
Okay, well put, my friend. I urge again people to go to the Mill Valley Public Library website and listen to David's very compelling oral history. I want to say especially thank you, Margaret, for staying up. I think it's a different time zone for you.
It is.
And for all your hard work. Finally, it's so nice to meet you after hearing about you and your oral history. David, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you for all your hard work. And before we go, I just want to remind people that the Historical Society is very pleased to have published Adventures of Two Coast Miwok Children by our dear board member and author, Betty Girk. Here's her book. We should have it soon. This beautiful book brings alive Marin County's Coast Miwok legacy as it explores the daily lives of a real boy and girl who lived in neighboring villages on San Francisco Bay in the late 1700s. The little boy in the story is named Huik Musa, but he would grow up to be known as Chief Marin, Marin County's namesake. It's a precious and truly beautiful book and a great gift for children and adults. To order directly, please visit the Mill Valley Historical Society website. And finally, I hope you will all join us next month. That's September 1st. Our guest speaker is my friend and wonderful historian, Brian Crawford. I asked him, might he write a talk about the history of hiking trails on Mount Tamalpais and in Marin County. He himself created two incredible hikes, trails with historical signage in San Rafael. And he's done a wonderful job, lots of work on this. And I don't think there's any other talks just quite like it. So we hope we'll see you next month. Again, I want to say thanks to Natalie. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening and caring about this book and each other. I guess we'll call it a wrap. Thanks, Talbots.
Thank you, Deborah.
God bless, and be well.
And you as well.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.